Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. In this video, what we're going to do is we're going to cover micro frontends in great detail. We're going to try to understand exactly what micro frontends are, why we would want to use them, and then we are going to be building a website with micro frontends. So the first thing that we need to do is understand exactly what a micro frontend is. Now, if you do a quick Google search, this is the definition that you're going to get. Microfrontends are a new pattern where web application UIs are composed from independent fragments that can be built by different teams using different technologies. Now, I think this is a relatively good definition, but if this doesn't make much sense to you, let me go ahead and explain it by showing you what exactly we are going to be building. So we are going to be building this application right over here. Now, this doesn't seem like it makes much sense, but I want you to imagine that this is an application, a dashboard application that helps certain users understand analytics for their business. Now, again, the charts don't really make much sense, but that is besides the point. I just want you to imagine that. Now, you can see here that this application is composed of two different charts. So this UI right over here, this bar chart, and then this right over here, this line chart. This is another piece of UI. Now, typically, if we were building a front-end application, these two UIs would exist in the exact same code base. So they'd live in the exact same directory, and they would typically use the exact same language or framework. So for example, if I built this out in React, well, this right here would be a React component. This over here would be another React component, and they would live in the overall React application. However, in this case, this is actually not what is going on. This UI piece right over here is actually its own separate front-end application, written in its own directory and its own language or framework, and then the same thing right over here. And somehow I was able to just put them together inside of this one web page that is under localhost 8080. Now, to prove this to you, I'm going to go to localhost 8081 where this UI is hosted. So you can see that this is its own application right over here. And then this other chart right here is hosted on localhost 8082. And again, this is its own application. Now, this right here could be built in React. This over here could be built in Vue. And somehow, some way, what I did was I got both of those applications. Now I am hosting them on this overall web page on localhost 8080. And that is exactly what a micro frontend is. This right here is a fragment UI that can be built in any language by any different team. And then the same thing right over here. This is a fragment UI that can be built by any language and any different team. And somehow we are putting them together inside of this overall web page. So that right there is a micro frontend. Now, why would we ever want to utilize a micro frontend? Well, a couple of reasons. Let's say, like I said before, that this right here takes a lot of code to build. So this is very code extensive. This is, it takes a lot of engineering time. And this right over here, this UI piece also takes a lot of engineering time. It takes a lot of code. Now, if they were all in the same code base, anytime we make a change here, it could potentially affect this UI piece right over here. Plus, if we ever wanted to deploy a change here, well, we're going to have to deploy the whole application as a whole. So the deployment unit is all together. Whereas if we divided them into micro frontends, the team can utilize whatever language it wants to build this chart. Because over here, if they're all in the same code base, then well, we have to use the same language regardless of the UI piece. Maybe this right over here, this line chart, it's really, really easy to do with Angular, whereas this bar chart is really easy to do with React. If they were all a big monolithic application, we have to use the same language. Now with a micro front end, this team is essentially can develop this chart right over here in complete isolation with whatever language it wants to and not worry about anything else. It can go ahead and deploy any sort of changes, and it's only going to change in the overall application this part right over here, and it's not going to change this chart right here. The same thing goes on with this UI piece. It's its own complete application. If we want to deploy a change, if we want to work on a specific framework with it, well, once we do that, it's only going to affect this piece and not this piece. So this allows us to separate our concerns and have two different teams work on these micro front ends in complete isolation. So this is what we are going to be building. Now I know I said we can build things in React and Vue, etc., etc. But for this particular application, each front end is going to be made with pure vanilla JavaScript. So this is going to be pure vanilla JavaScript, and this over here will be pure vanilla JavaScript. However, they are going to be separate projects, and again, as you can see, they can be hosted on their own. Now, the reason why I'm not going to be using React and Angular and Vue for this is because connecting these two micro front ends together into a web page is actually a relatively complicated process. And if I start introducing React and Vue and Angular, it's going to take away from understanding that particular process, and I can pretty much guarantee you it will confuse you. Now, this is going to be an introductory video to micro frontends. If this is a popular video and you guys want to learn more about it, I can of course make a part 2 where I connect two different frameworks, two different front-end frameworks together to make an overall app. So that is what we are going to be building. So let's actually just go ahead and do that in the next section. Alright, my good friends, in this section, what we're going to do is learn exactly how we can build our very first micro front end. Now this right over here, this micro front end is very simply just going to be this UI piece over here. And we're going to figure out exactly how we can go ahead and run it on its own port and web server. Later on, what we're going to do is of course combine them together into this web page. But first, let's just begin by building this. So I went ahead and I opened up an empty directory inside of VS Code. In here, what we're going to do is we're going to open up our terminal and we are going to create a brand new micro front end. So this right here is bar chart. So I'm going to say, let me zoom in here a little bit. I'm going to say micdir make directory, and I'm going to say bar chart. Now this only works if you're on Mac or Linux. If you are on Windows, you can just go ahead and just click this right over here. And once you do that, we should see this bar chart directory. So inside of this bar chart directory, I'm going to do an npm init-y. This is just going to initialize our node application. That's going to add this package.json file. Now what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to install a few dependencies. So let's just go ahead and install them, and then I'll talk about exactly what they do a little bit later. So let's go over here to the bar charts directory. Let me zoom in here once more. So to the bar chart directory, we are going to install npm install. We're going to install echarts. So this is the library that we're going to use that's going to allow us to build these charts. We're not going to build them from scratch. So echarts, and then we're going to also install HTML Webpack -plugin. Now Webpack is something that we are going to be using throughout our process with working with micro front ends. If you don't know them, don't worry. We're going to talk about Webpack in great detail. Now, this is a special Webpack library that allows us to do a certain thing that I'll talk about a little bit later. We're also going to install NodeMon. We're also going to install Webpack itself. And then we're also going to install Webpack-CLI. And lastly, we are going to install Webpack Dev Server, like so. So let's go ahead and install them. Now, I highly recommend that you actually install them with the versions that I have. So at the time of recording, all the versions seem to work together to build this micro front end. we're getting an issue here. So it's saying, oh, yes, this should be CLI, not SLI, CLI. So at the point when I'm recording, all the versions, the latest versions, seem to work together well to build a micro front end, but things could go wrong with future versions, and I highly recommend just opening up my package.json and then installing these dependencies with these versions. All right, so that is pretty much all it is that we need to install. We're not going to be using them all at once. We're going to use them one at a time. So let's actually just go ahead and build out our micro front end. So over here, what I'm going to do is I am going to create a public directory, and inside of this public directory, I'm going to have an index.html. And then right in here, I am going to add just a boilerplate for the HTML. So if you're using Emmet, you can actually do an exclamation mark, then click on the exclamation mark, and you can see here that we are getting a little bit of boilerplate. So over here, this is our index.html. And then let's also create another directory called source. And then in here, we're going to have our index.js file. So this is what we're going to do in order to, right in here, instead of our index.js file, this is where we're going to put all of our chart logic from that library that we installed. So to understand this logic right over here, what we're going to need to do is go to the eCharts website, and you can see in order to create a particular chart, what you're going to need to do is have logic that looks something like this. So we don't really care about the logic itself. I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste this logic, because this logic doesn't really matter. I don't really care about that. I care about the micro front end part. So I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste this. So let's go ahead here. Let's copy and paste this logic. I'm going to paste it right in there. Now over here, of course, what we're going to need to do is import eCharts. So let's go here and let's just say import star, that means everything, as eCharts. So as eCharts, and then we're going to import that from, well, eCharts. So what is this going to do? Well, this is going to, first of all, we're going to go ahead and we're going to initialize a chart on a particular canvas element, and this canvas element is called main. I'm going to call this bar chart like so. And then what we need to do is right over here, we can say my chart dot set options, and then I'm going to just go ahead and copy all of these options and just paste them right in here. We can get rid of that. So that's pretty much all it is that we need to do in order to set up our chart micro front end. The last thing actually is to go to the index.html, because right now, as you can see, it's looking for an element, a canvas element with an ID of bar chart. So let's go over here and let's add that canvas element. So I'm going to say canvas, and we're going to give it a width of 400, a height of 400, and then we are also going to give it an ID. So we're going to say ID is equal to, and then the ID is equal to bar chart, like we said over here. So now that we have all that set up, that actually begs the question, how in the world are we going to run this micro front end? Now, as you can see here at the very top, we are using an import statement, and browsers actually do not really understand import statements at the moment. So what we need to do is somehow compile this into something that the browser understands. And that is exactly where Webpack comes into place. So let's actually talk about that in the next section. In this video, what we're going to do is go ahead and run our micro front end inside of our browser. But in order to do this, what we need to do is utilize a tool called Webpack. Now, of course, in order to utilize this tool, we first need to understand Webpack. So that's what we're going to be doing in this section. We're going to try to understand it, and then we're going to go ahead and utilize it. Now, over here, just as a quick reminder, inside of our source directory, we built this index.js file, and right here we have this import statement in the first line. Now, this import statement is not going to be understood by browsers. It does not understand what import is. Instead, what we have to do is convert this to something that the browser understands. And also, we have a bunch of different modules here with different JS files, and these are just some dependencies. Again, we have to get those dependencies inside of our browser. So how are we going to do that? Well, we are going to be using Webpack. So Webpack is a bundler. So very simply, what it does is it takes all the JS files, all of the different files that we have in our application. Doesn't necessarily have to be JS. It could be SAS files, could be .png files, .jpeg files. And what it does is it takes all those files and it bundles them together into one file. So you can see here, this is how our application looks like right now. Then it goes through Webpack, and then it just gets all of those JS files and bundles them up into one file. And so this is actually really great because, well, in our browser, we ideally do not want to start rendering multiple files. We don't want to give it multiple files. That could be inefficient. Instead, we'd like to just give it just one file with everything it is that we need. So that is what Webpack does. But Webpack also, what it does is it formats the code in a way that the browser is going to understand. So you can see here we have this import statement. It's going to go ahead and convert it to something like this that the browser understands. So over here we can write the way that we would like to, and then again it's going to convert it to what the browser is going to understand. So that is exactly what we are going to be doing. We're going to be using Webpack to bundle everything together and convert it to language that the browser understands. So let's go over here just as a quick reminder. Right now we have the index.js file. We also have the echarts.js file, which is a dependency. And what Webpack is going to do is combine it all together to a main.js file. And this is what we're going to be running in the browser. So let's go ahead and do that. So over here, in order to configure Webpack, I'm going to say webpack.config.js. So webpack.config.js. And then in here, what we're going to do is we're going to do module.exports. And right inside of this object, this is where we're going to configure our Webpack. So the first thing I'm going to say is mode development to say that we are in development mode. And then I'm going to say, hey, I want to run this process on a particular server. So over here, I'm going to say dev server, and then I'm going to say I want to run this on port, let's say port 1001, something like that. I've never seen people use port 1000, so I'm going to go ahead and use it. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the package.json, and right in here, I already added this. We're going to have a start script. And then right in here, we're going to run, whenever we run this start script, we're going to run webpack serve. And that is going to do exactly what we have here. So it's going to bundle everything together and actually run it inside of our app. So let's go open up our terminal here. And let's close this. Let's close this, close everything. And what I'm going to do here is just npm run start. So once I do that, well, I actually have to go into the bar chart directory, of course, and then I'm going to do an npm run start. And as soon as I do that, you can see everything is working a-okay, everything is looking great. So now what I can do is if I go over to localhost, let's go to localhost 1001, you can see, okay, I'm getting something, but I'm not really getting exactly what it is that I want. So the reason for this is because, of course, the application Webpack doesn't know where my index.html is. And that is where that HTML Webpack plugin comes into place. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say plugins, and this is going to be an array because we have multiple plugins in here. And I am going to require in HTML Webpack plugin. So HTML Webpack plugin, and I am going to say is equal to require. We're going to get that from HTML Webpack plugin. Then over here, we're going to instantiate new HTML Webpack plugin, and then we are going to define exactly where our HTML lives. So where our index.html lives. And that is going to be inside of the public directory and then index.html. Let's go ahead and save that now. And now if I were to refresh, let me go ahead and just completely refresh the configuration. So let's go here, let's run that up again. Should get a success, awesome. And there we go. You can see now we have our chart inside of this index.html, and it's actually being served on localhost 1001. So this is really good. Now you might be wondering, okay, well this right over here, it outputs a specific file, but inside of this index.html, don't we need to have a script tag that links to that particular bundled JS file? Well, actually, no, we don't. And that is the magic of this plugin right over here. So let's think about what happens here. So over here, we bundle this up into a file called main.js, or it could be called whatever it is that we want. And the bundler, the HTML Webpack plugin, what it does is it takes any of the files that were generated by Webpack, and then it automatically adds them to the index.html file that we have specified right over here. So it's going to automatically add the script tags, whatever tags it is that we need, into that index.html. And that's why over here, it looks completely empty. So I hope that makes sense. Now we got this one micro front end running on its own in complete isolation inside of our application. So this is really, really good. But now what we want to do is, well, we want to figure out a way to start combining micro front ends together. So let's look into that in the next video. In this section, what we're going to do is we're going to learn about a very important concept in micro front ends, and that is host and remotes. So let's actually go back to our application over here. So this is the complete application that we want to build. So remember, this is one micro front end. This is another micro front end. So you might be thinking, overall, we have, well, 2 front ends inside of this application. But that is actually not the case. We actually have 3. So the first one is this micro front end right over here. And then we have this other micro front end right over here. And then lastly, the third one is the whole application as a whole. So you can kind of think of it as the parent front end that is housing all of these other micro front ends. So that right there is actually known as the host, whereas these ones are known as remotes. So that's just some terminology. So again, right here we have the host that is going to house the overall micro front end, and then we're going to have, well, a remote, and then we can have as many remotes as we want. So let's actually go ahead and create this host. Now, typically this host is going to be called container because it is, well, containing all of the other micro front ends. So I'm going to say container here. So I'm going to go over here. I'm going to say terminal. We're going to move into that container. We're going to do an npm init, and we're going to need to do a little bit of installation. Now, just to save us from writing the command, the npm commands, what I'm going to do is I am going to copy this package.json file, and then in here, I am going to go ahead and paste that in, and we're just going to go ahead and remove the things that we do not need. So the thing that we don't need is eCharts. Everything else is we do need it. Now, we don't need eCharts because, well, the host is not going to have any of those code. Those are going to be inside of the remote. So let's go ahead and get this up and running. So what I'm going to do is just to do a quick npm install. So I'm going to do a Control-C, npm install to install all of the dependencies. And while that's going, we're going to go ahead and configure the webpack.config.js. So in here, let's do module.exports. And we're going to do something very similar in order to get this up and running. Now, we're going to add more things later, of course, to this to this container. But the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this HTML Webpack plugin. So let's add that in there. And I'm going to say mode development. And we're going to say dev server. And that is going to be port, let's do 1000. And we're going to, of course, do the plugins array. We're going to have the new HTML Webpack plugin. And then over here, we're going to specify where our HTML file lives. So I'm going to say, well, public.index.html. So this is looking pretty good. Now, of course, what we need to do is similarly to what we had before, we're going to have a public directory with our index.html. And then we're also going to have a source directory with an index.js file. So in here for now, we're not going to add any special code. I'm just going to add a console.log. I'm going to say container, something like that. In here, we're just going to have our regular template. So this is really all it is that we need to do in order to run our container, our host. So let's just do an npm run start and then go to localhost 1000. That's where we created it. So let's go over here. Let's go to localhost 1000. And as you can see, we should have this blank application. If I go ahead and inspect it, we are getting some error. We're saying, hey, we failed to load a resource. I was not expecting that error. So let's go here. It's just a fav icon error. But nonetheless, you can see right here, we have the container up and running. So now what do I want to do? Well, what I want to do is I want to somehow get this micro front end that is running on localhost 1001 to somehow show up on this container, which is running on localhost 1000. So let's actually talk about how we're going to do that in the next section. So we got our container up and running, but now what we want to do is we want to, well, showcase that bar chart micro front end that we created. So how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to do that with something known as module federation. Now, this is a very fancy term, but very simply, all it is the process of loading separately compiled application at runtime. So whenever I go ahead and I run my application on localhost 1000, what I want to start doing is, well, start loading those other applications, these separate compiled applications, in this case, the bar chart and then the line chart, when I run that app. So it's going to go ahead and load it and render it onto localhost 1000. So just as a quick little diagram, I go ahead and I run localhost 1000. So now we are at runtime. It's going to go ahead and make a request to localhost 1001 because that's exactly where my bar chart is living, asking it for the content, and then it's going to go ahead and render it. So that's pretty much it. And now, of course, we can make multiple requests because we could have multiple micro front ends. So we can make a request to localhost 1001. We can also make another request to localhost 1002. And we can render those micro front ends inside of our host application. Remember, these are the hosts. These are the remotes. So let's actually go ahead and configure module federation inside of our application. Now, just as a quick warning, this is going to be relatively complicated and there's going to be a lot of different configuration. Now, I shot this video multiple times and I think it's actually best if we just go ahead and write out the configuration and get module federation to work. And then in the next section, I'll explain everything line by line. So don't worry if anything doesn't make sense at this point. We're just going to go ahead, go through the flow. I'll explain it later on. All right. So what I'm going to do here is we're going to have to configure our Webpack config in both the bar chart as well as the container a little bit differently. So what we're going to need to do is, well, we're going to need to get that module federation plugin from Webpack. So over here, I'm going to say const, and I'm going to say module federation. So federation plugin, and that is going to come from Webpack. So I'm going to say Webpack, And it's going to come specifically from webpack/lib/container. So we should have a container in here. And then lastly, we're going to have a module federation plugin. So this is going to allow us to do that module federation. So over here inside of this plugin, inside of the container, what we're going to say is new. And then we're going to say module federation plugin. We're going to go ahead and instantiate this. And we're going to go ahead and, well, we're going to invoke it, and we're going to provide it some options. So the first option is going to be the name. I'm going to go ahead and call this container. Could be anything you want. And then I'm going to say remotes. So we're going to specify all of the different remotes. Now the remote that I want is going to be a key value pair. I'm going to call this bar chart. And then over here, we're going to say bar chart as a string. And then I'm going to say at HTTP, I'm going to specify exactly where I can find this bar chart. So this is going to live on localhost 1001, remember. So I'm going to say at HTTP --localhost, and then I'm going to say :1001, and then I'm going to specify a specific file. And this is I'm going to call this file remote entry.js. Now, again, this probably doesn't make much sense to you. That's a-okay. This whole thing doesn't make much sense, even though you can probably guess that I'm specifying all of the different remotes. You might be wondering why I have to call this bar chart. Why do I need a bar chart here? But you can probably guess that we're going to make a request to HTTP localhost 1000, which is where our bar chart is living, to get that content. Now, why we have to specify this remote entry file, again, I'll explain that a little bit later. But that's all it is that we actually need to do inside of our container Webpack config. So now let's go over here, and I'm going to go ahead and just copy this module federation import or require, because it's kind of long, because we're going to need to do something very similar here. So here I'm going to specify new module federation, and then I'm going to say name. This is going to be bar chart. So bar chart. And make sure that the name is exactly what I have here, because it's important. And then we're going to say file name. And then over here, I'm going to say remote entry.js. And then I'm going to say exposes. And then over here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, this is not going to make much sense. Do not worry. We're going to specify a directory. We're going to say bar chart index. And then over here, I'm going to say source and then index like so. Now, what I like to do is specifically have my module federations at the very top. So let's go ahead and do that and just have the HTML Webpack plugin in the bottom. So let's go here. And let's go ahead and specify that. Okay, so this is looking pretty good. All right, so now what we actually need to do is inside of our container, what I want to do is I actually want to import, well, this inside of the index.js file. Now, just inside of the container, our source file is going to look a little bit different. We're going to have something called bootstrap.js. And then we're also going to have our index.js. So our bootstrap.js is going to have basically all the code that we want hosted inside of our index.html file. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to import in, and I'm going to say bar chart and then slash bar chart and then bar chart index. This again might not make all too much sense to you. That is a-okay. And then over here, let's go ahead and also remove this container, or this console. We can also add it here if we want to. And then inside of our index.js, I'm going to import all of the contents from the bootstrap.js. Now, what I want to do is I want to run these content as soon as I import them. So instead of importing it like this, what I'm going to do is import it like a function. So I'm going to go here. And again, I can't stress this enough. If this doesn't make sense to you, a-okay, we're going to explain it later. But for now, let's just get it up and running. So I'm going to invoke it like a function. I'm going to say bootstrap like so. Now, the last thing that I need is to go into my index.html file, because that is all the configuration that we need in order to run our bar chart. But our index.html is expecting to have inside of it, well, this canvas element. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go inside of here, copy that, and actually put it inside of the container. So let's go ahead and save that. So that's all it is that we need to do. If everything has worked correctly, and I hope it has, this should be running a-okay. So in order to get this to work, let's just restart all of our processes. So let's go ahead and start the bar chart. And let's go to localhost 1001. Everything seems a-okay. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go to localhost. We're going to go ahead localhost 1000 which is 1000 to start our container. So let's go here. Let's give it some time. All right, everything seems successful. Now the moment of truth, if I refresh, we do not see it, unfortunately. A bit of time to figure out exactly why this wasn't working, but I figured it out, and it's because of the ID right over here. So this canvas has an ID of bar chart. However, if we were to go to our Webpack config.js, you can see here that the name is also bar chart. Now this, we don't have to really get into it, but it causes some conflicts. So what we need to do here is to rename our ID, our canvas ID, to something else. So I'm going to call it, let's say, bar chart dev, like so. So bar chart dash dev. Now, of course, what we're going to need to do is go ahead and save this. And let's go ahead and change it in all the other instances where we use it. So over here, also in the index.js file, we're going to have to convert this to bar chart dev. And then lastly, inside of the public, we also need to convert this to bar chart dev. And then over here, I believe that's pretty much it. So that's all it is that we need to do. And then there we go. You can see now in localhost 1001, everything is working a-okay. Now that we have written everything up and we got it running, I think it is time for an explanation, just to explain exactly what is going on. So let's go over here to our application, and let's begin with the bar chart. So over here we have this bar chart. Let's go into the webpack.config.js. Now what I'm going to do just for now is inside of the plugins, I am going to comment out the module federation. So let's go ahead and comment that out. Now as a quick reminder, when I explained Webpack to you, I explained that it is going to bundle all of our files, our JS files, our HTML files, into one file that the browser can understand. So as a quick refresher, we could have two files over here, and Webpack is going to bundle them up into one file. And then over here, you can see that it is called main.js. Now, right now, we actually cannot see any of the files because Webpack is not emitting them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the package.json, and this used to be Webpack serve. We're just going to change it to Webpack on its own. So now let's go open up our terminal, and let's move into the bar chart directory. And I'm going to run npm run start in order to run Webpack. So let's go ahead and do that. And now you can see we have this dist directory. And essentially, this is just all of the files that Webpack is emitting. So if we open it up, you can see now we have our main.js file. And this contains all of the bundled code that we are going to run inside of our browser. And then also has the index.html. Now this is very similar to the one that we have inside of our public directory, except remember the HTML Webpack plugin has added this script tag right over here, so we don't have to. So I hope this makes sense. I've already explained this to you. Again, we have all these files, it bundles them up into one. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and uncomment the module federation plugin. So I'm going to uncomment it, and I'm going to run Webpack again just to see all of the different files that get emitted. So now you can see we actually get quite a bit more files emitted. We get this vendors node module echart index.js. We get this source index underscore js.js, and we also get this familiar remote entries file. So let's actually talk about exactly what is going on here. So Webpack, when we have the module federation, we still have our main.js, which means we can still run our application on its own in complete isolation, but we also get these files. Now, these files are all of the files that we need in order to run our micro front end. So we need the source index.js, which is going to correspond to this index.js over here. So essentially what the source index.js is, again, it bundles them up and it compiles it into something that the browser understands, specifically just this file right over here. So if I go to the dist and then I go to source index, you can see in this eval statement, we have all of that code. So you can see my chart, we got the title, we got the legend, we got everything. Now we also have inside of the index.js, we're importing in echarts. So we also have all of the code that we need to run echarts in this file over here. Now this file is a little bit more messy. It's a lot of things going on, but if we ever want to run echarts, this is the file that we are going to run. Well, then what is this remote entries file? Well, this remote entries file is very simply a set of instructions that we can follow to, well, run any one of these files. So let's say our application needs to run, well, this index as well as this echarts. Well, I'm going to make a request to this remote entry telling it, hey, I need to run the index and I need to run the echarts file over here. And essentially what the remote entries does is it says, well, here's a list of instructions. It follows those instructions, and then it is able to run those two apps inside of the application. And that right there, very simply, I hope this makes sense. That right there is what we are doing right over here. So what we are doing here is, well, we want to run the bar charts, and we want to specify the remotes. So we're going to make a request to localhost 1001/remote entry. So any file that we need to run, well, we're going to make a request to, again, localhost 1001/remote entry, which lives inside of this micro front end. Now you might be wondering, well, how does this container know exactly what it needs to run? How does it know that it needs to run the index.js as well as the echarts? Well, the magic is happening right over here inside of this bootstrap, directory, in this bootstrap's file. So what are we doing here? Well, we're importing bar chart and then /bar chart index. Now, this bar chart index is very familiar, because if I go back to here, to the bar chart over here, you can see that what we did here is we said exposes, and then we said bar chart index, and then colon source index. So this right here is very simply an alias. So instead of doing something like this, so instead of doing bar charts /source/index, because we were able to alias it, it's something a little bit cleaner that looks something like that. So very simply, what I'm trying to do is from this bar chart directory, I'm trying to load, well, the source index. Now over here, you might be confused. What is this bar chart right here? Well, this bar chart is going to correspond to this bar chart right here. So essentially what's going to happen here, as soon as we import something, Webpack is first going to go to the node modules. Do we have a directory called, or do we have a dependency, something that we installed called bar chart? If we don't, then what it's going to do is going to go to the Webpack file, and it's going to look at any of the remotes. it's going to see, oh yeah, we do have bar charts right over here. And then it's going to make a request to that remote entry file in order to get, well, the source.index. Now inside of the source.index, well, we are importing eChart, and we'll also have this index.js file. And that is why it knows in the remote entry exactly what files it needs to run and load. Hope that makes sense. Now, the last thing that I want to discuss is this right over here, the name. So the name right here inside of the bar chart needs to match this name right here. So this name right here. So this bar chart right here, this part, I know we have multiple bar charts. This bar chart needs to match this bar chart. Now, this bar chart right over here, well, that's going to match this bar chart. And again, we can call this whatever it is that we want. Now, the last thing that I want to explain is, well, why do we have a bootstrap as well as an index.js that is going to, let me just get rid of this stuff. I'm going to cut it out. Why do we have a bootstrap as well as an index.js that very simply just invokes bootstrap? Well, let's actually go ahead and let's just try to run this code inside of the index.js and just completely forego this bootstrap. So I'm going to go here. I'm going to open up my terminal. And let's go to our package.json. Let's change this back to Webpack serve. All right, so let's go here. Let's go here. I am going to first run the bar chart. And this one should still run a-okay. So if I go to localhost 1001, everything is fine. And now let me go ahead and just restart this now. And seems as though everything is okay. I'm going to go ahead and refresh now, but you can see we are getting an error. We're not loading anything. So I'm going to go to the console, and you can see that, well, we have some sort of error. Now, what is this error? Well, right now, at this point in time, what we are doing is very simply just loading. Well, as soon as we try to run this, what we're going to try to do is import in barchart / barchart index. And this is going to absolutely assume that this is going to exist inside of our node modules. Because as soon as we run this, Webpack is not going to have enough time to process it and see, well, no, hey, the bar chart does not exist in the node modules, but it exists inside of the Webpack config. So by very simply importing the file bootstrap, what we're doing is we're just giving Webpack some time in order to, well, figure out that, yes, this does not exist in the node modules, but it does exist in the webpack.config.js. So that is essentially what we are doing here. We're just giving Webpack some time to figure out where this import is coming from. So that's pretty much it. I hope that is clear. It is a relatively complicated thing, and you can imagine if we built this stuff with React or Angular, how complicated it would be. But I hope this makes sense. Now, in the next section, what we're going to do is we're going to work on our very last chart, which is going to be our line chart. Okay, my good friends, in this video, what we're going to do is adding the other micro front end inside of our container. Now, this is going to be extremely identical to what we did here. So I highly encourage that you pause the video and try it out on your own. And as I'm saying that, as you can see, I'm moving my mouse and my cat is hitting it. So that's why I laughed a little bit. Nonetheless, let's just go ahead and get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to open up my terminal and create a brand new directory. So over here, I'm going to say micdir. I'm going to call this line chart. Now, inside of line chart, I'm going to copy everything inside of the package.json inside of this bar chart. So let's go ahead and copy that in. My cat is in the way. I can't even see the screen. Bad cat. Let's just get rid of the cat. There we go. Got rid of the cat. So now what I can do here is I can paste in that package.json file that has all of the dependencies. So let's move into the line chart. Let's do an npm install to install all of the dependencies. And now let's go ahead and write out the Webpack config file. So we're going to go ahead and write it out from scratch just because, it's just better. It might go into your mind if we just continuously write it. So let's go over here where I'm going to say webpack.config.js. And the only thing I'm going to copy is these two imports because we're going to need both the HTML plugin as well as the module federation plugin. So I'm going to say module.exports. I'm going to say that is going to be equal to this object. Then over here, we're going to say mode development. And then what I'm going to say is dev server. And I'm going to specify that this is going to run on port 1002. So remember, this bar chart is running on port 1000. This the bar chart is on 1001. The container's on 1000. This one's going to be on 1002. So now what else do we need? Well, we need to specify the plugins, of course. So let's go over here. And the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to say plugins, and that's going to be an array. So we're going to say new module federation plugin. And then over here, we're going to invoke it, and then we're going to provide it with some options. Now, the options, again, are going to be extremely similar to what we have right over here. So again, it's going to be very, very similar. So let's go over here. We're going to say, in this case, we're going to say the name. We're going to say the name is going to be what is it called? We're going to say the line chart. That's what we're going to call it. And then remember, this name is going to match up to the name inside of the container. So remember, that is very important. And then we're going to say file name, and that's going to be the remote entry file. We can call this whatever it is that we want, but let's just be consistent. And then we're going to say exposes, just so we can have an alias. And I am going to say, I'm going to call this linear chart, like so. Let's make it all capital, linear chart index. And that's going to be inside of the source/index.js file. We didn't create that yet, but we will later. And now what we want to do is we want to have our, HTML Webpack plugin. And that is very simply just going to say that the template is inside of the public/index.html. So that's pretty much all it is that we need for this config. So let's go over here into our line chart. Let's create the public index.html. And I'm going to do the exclamation point over here. Let's also just get rid of all this stuff in the head. Might as well. Also get rid of this here. Now in here, I'm going to have a canvas element. So canvas. I'm going to give this an ID of, I'm going to say line chart dev. We're going to give it a width of 400, a height of 400 as well. Okay, so that's all it is that we need. Now we also need the source/index.js directory. Now in here, we're going to go ahead and create the line chart. Now I actually went ahead and I already copied the linear line chart, so we just don't have to go to the web page. I can link this repository so you can do the exact same. I'm just trying to remember exactly where I copied it. Yeah, right here. So this is the code. It doesn't really matter what this code is. It's just for creating the line chart. Now over here, we're going to give this the ID of line chart dev. So over here, line chart dev. There we go. That is looking pretty good. So let's get rid of that. Let's go ahead and save that. And that's pretty much it. So let's go ahead and try to run this on its own for now. Open up the terminal. And let's do an npm run start, which should run Webpack serve as it does. And it should run it on port 2002. And we are getting some sort of error here. Let's see what we did wrong. So cannot resolve. Yes, of course. Right here, this should be source. Let's go ahead and save that. And now let's try to rerun this. And I think it should be good. Okay, so now let's go over here and let's go. This is 2001. Let's go to 1002, and we get this line chart. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to add it right over here inside of the container. So let's remember what we need to do for that. Well, what we need to do is need to go to the Webpack config, and then over here. Well, this is a line chart, okay? And then over here, line chart. And let's just ensure that that is what we called it over here. So line chart. I'm just going to go ahead and copy this. So let's go back to here. Yeah, we called it line chart. Then at http:// local host, and then :1002/remote entry.js. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go into the Bootstrap, and now we're going to import in line chart. So remember, this line chart is going to correspond to this line chart right over here. And then this line chart, of course, corresponds to this one right here when we're making the request. And then we go back over here. We're going to say this time that this is going to be the line chart index. Now, of course, we're also going to need to copy this canvas element and add it here as well. So let's go ahead and add that. And that's pretty much all it is that we need to do. So let's go ahead and actually try to restart our container. All right, everything seems successful. And now if I refresh this, it appears as though we do not see it for some reason. So here's the canvas element, but there's nothing inside of it. I'm going to have to do a little bit of debugging to figure out why.